Hi, this is Joe Firestone with the In Depth program for New Macro Media. And it's roughly 9:05 on Thursday night, November 7th. Hope you're feeling well tonight. I'm certainly feeling well tonight, in spite of a very unfortunate new bill which has been introduced into the Senate with the co-sponsorship of a Democrat who's generally a fairly progressive Democrat. So, I want to talk about that new bill. Okay, I want to talk about the issue of whether our continued commitment to the free market will spell the end of the middle class in America. And if we get there, I want to talk about the history of America when it comes to nationalization. Surprisingly, during the last 100 years or so, we have nationalized all kinds of things. It's been rather common, but we seem to have forgotten that history today. And it'll be very interesting to go over that history, I think, as well. But before I go there, let me check in with you and see that my visuals and my sound are all right. Hi, Lana. Hi, Russell. Thank you for sharing. I certainly appreciate that. It would be nice if we'd get some more people here. Hi, Lana. Hi, Russell. I refreshed my page to see if I missed anything, but I don't seem to have missed anything. How's my sound? Do I have an echo tonight? Or can I safely proceed? Okay, Russ and Lana, is my sound okay? Please let me know. Thanks. Lana says sounds okay. Russ says sound isn't bad. Okay, good. Russ says I can safely proceed. Great. I'm safely proceeding. Thank you. So, as I said, there's a new budget bill in the Senate. Hmm. I don't know why this is showing me. I certainly shifted my view. Here we go. guess I did not shift the view. Here's an article from The Hill. The title of it is Bipartisan NZ White House Budget Bill, a very bad fix for deficits. This article was written by David A. Super, who's a professor at the Georgetown Law School in Washington, D.C. And Professor Super is not an economist as far as I know, but is a lawyer. So, of course, he feels competent to comment on whether something is a very bad fix for deficits or a very good fix for deficits, okay, or whether, in fact, there should be any fix for deficits. Somehow he feels competent to write an article about this in The Hill. We will see just how competent he is. However, let's get all of the extraneous matter out of the way and see this through clearly. See this clearly through clearly. Anyway, the news that the federal budget deficit has approached $1 trillion annually has evidently created very little reaction in Washington, D.C. As the article says, Washington has yawned. And Professor Super points out this is for two equally predictable reasons. Democratic economists do not see deficits in the current range as very problematic, while Democrats generally have repeatedly seen deficit panic actually manipulated to extract cuts from social programs that would otherwise have been, the cuts that is, unacceptable politically. Most Republicans, in turn, do not want to call attention to the deficit because their 2017 tax legislation played such a large role in expanding it. On the other hand, some have wildly overreacted to the news. Chief among these are Senators Mike Enzi, who's a Republican from Utah, who sometimes engages in bipartisan shenanigans, and who is currently the chairman of the Budget Committee in the Senate. Of course, the ranking member in the Budget Committee in the Senate, last I heard, was one Bernie Sanders. As we all know, a leading presidential candidate, some would say the actual front runner, okay, in the race at this point. So anyway, the committee advanced a budget reform plan. So it appears the Democrats, okay, were unifying against a Joe Kennedy Senate bid, where Joe Kennedy would run as a Democrat from Rhode Island, and the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee. So evidently, Sheldon Whitehouse is now the ranking member, okay, of the committee, which must mean that Bernie Sanders has resigned as the ranking member, even though, of course, he still is in the Senate. Perhaps the campaign is draining so much that he's not able to do that as well. Anyway, this week, the committee plans to mark up some legislation or proposed legislation that would radically change the congressional budget process in ways likely to have severe unintended consequences, said David Super. I certainly agree with him, about that. But we'll see what kind of cure he recommends for that. Their bill, Senate Bill 2765, S 2765, would make a number of modest but worthwhile changes to the way Congress writes and implements its budgets. The centerpiece of the legislation, however, is an aggressive new procedure forcing Congress to vote on reducing the deficit whenever the CBO's estimate of the deficit 10 years out is worse than that assumed in the prior year's resolution. So in other words, if the prior year has a resolution that is essentially projecting out a deficit of 4% over 10 years, and the new budget resolution seems to suggest that there's going to be a deficit of 5% over the next 10 years, then Congress has to vote on reducing the deficit whenever that kind of thing happens. And they have to do it through a reconciliation process, as long as this law would hold. So this automatic reconciliation legislation is likely to become a vehicle for making deep cuts in Medicare and Medicaid tax credits for low-wage workers, farm programs, and other direct spending or, quote, entitlement, unquote, programs, often at times when the economy is in a precarious condition. I think David Super is very right about that. And he says, under S 2765, Congress would enact budget resolutions, general blueprints for revenues to be collected and spending to occur in odd-numbered years. Why? In odd-numbered years. Because, of course, Congress wants to take the pressure off of perhaps doing that in even-numbered years, so as to insulate themselves from the pressures of election campaigns, which might make it harder for Congress to do things in a bipartisan way, because they might have to listen more closely to what their constituents want. What a terrible thing. These resolutions would be required to include projections for the amount of debt held by the public a decade later. The following year, the Congressional Budget Office would estimate the publicly held debt in that same year, now 9 years in the future. If CBO's estimate of the future deficit was higher than that assumed in the prior year's budget resolution, the new law's automatic reconciliation procedures would kick in. Now, just to be quite clear, this paragraph, the previous paragraph, assumes that the deficit and the debt amount to the same thing, so that if the CBO estimates the publicly held debt now 9 years in the future, is higher than the amount that was actually projected in the year before, then the new laws, but reconciliation procedures would kick in. Uh, so, since the debt is not the same, K, as the deficit, what the debt is the principal outstanding, okay, of Treasury securities that have been issued. So the outstanding principal of all the securities, okay, the sum of those defines, okay, the national debt. Okay, but the deficit is the amount the federal government has spent subtracted from the amount of revenue that the federal government has actually brought in. So it really isn't clear exactly what this is saying. It seems to be conflating the debt and the deficit. Now, why are these not the same thing? Well, simply because Congress, in its wisdom, could pass a bill to mandate that the Federal Reserve simply make available to the Treasury all the money that is needed in a particular fiscal year, all the reserves that are needed in a fiscal year to pay back the debt due in that particular year. In that case, the debt would be going down each year and would be going down rather fast, while the future deficit might still be higher than that was actually previously projected by the CBO. So you could actually have the debt going down and the future deficit actually going up. But still, under this bill, that would evidently be a terrible thing. That would kick in the automatic reconciliation procedures that would be designed to reduce the deficit as we go forward. How much would it have to reduce the deficit? Well, it seems as though this bill is aiming at a zero deficit, is aiming at a glide path to a balanced budget. But what if a balanced budget is not a desirable thing to do? What if a full employment budget, due to the trade deficits of the United States, is such that to have a full employment budget, what we'd have to do is to deficit spend to the tune of 15% of GDP, okay, in a particular year. Well, then, according to this bill, we'd be out of luck. We just wouldn't have a full employment budget. In fact, as long as we had trade deficits, we would never be able to enact a full employment budget because of the passage of this particular bill. But going on with the article, the bill's automatic reconciliation process would allow the Budget Committee to determine unilaterally the aggregate level of deficit reduction to be achieved, how those savings would be divided among the various authorizing committees of jurisdiction, and how savings would be split between revenue increases and spending cuts. Under current reconciliation procedures, however, the Budget Committee prepares the recommendations, but the entire Senate votes on whether to initiate the reconciliation process, and if it does, can amend the amount and allocation of revenue increases and spending cuts. So David Super points out both the bill's trigger for action and its rules for automatic reconciliation are deeply flawed. The result is likely to be both unnecessary economic harm to the country and a further corruption of a budget process that the bill's sponsors admit is already broken, quote unquote. The new bill would trigger auto-reconciliation anytime CBO's estimates of publicly held debt in a distant year increased, from one year to the next. Although this increase could result from fiscally irresponsible action by the Congress in the intervening year, many other factors, such as changes in technical estimating methodologies, could also drive such a change. In particular, economic downturns increase future public debt by reducing revenues and increasing spending on need-based programs such as unemployment insurance and food assistance. Thus, S2765 likely would trigger auto-reconciliation at the very time the economy was slipping into a recession. I have to say, right here and now, I don't understand how a fairly intelligent person like Sheldon Whitehouse could possibly sign his name to this particular bill. I've never perceived that particular senator to be so lacking in smarts as to want to tie the hands of a Senate when the need for expanding deficits come. Sheldon Whitehouse is very aware that there are times when we need expanding deficits and not decreasing deficits. Now, he may not be aware that under present conditions, there is never a time when we need to be decreasing deficits, or almost never. In other words, customarily speaking, since our trade deficits at certain times may well be going up, we may need to have deficits every year for a very long period of time if we want to pass a full employment budget. Anyway, when the economy is slipping into a recession, that's the very time, says the article, when it needs more, not less stimulation. The result of budget cuts at this point would be to deepen and lengthen the recession and to trigger auto-reconciliation again in subsequent years and put the country into a downward spiral because we'd be having deficits growing all the time because of the recession. Then we'd have to keep on triggering the budget cuts until finally the economy totally collapsed. If the bill did trigger auto-reconciliation, it would endow the Budget Committee in the Senate with staggering powers. Now, well, maybe they're hoping that Bernie Sanders would rather go back to the Budget Committee than be the president, because then he could be the ranking member of the Budget Committee again, and if the Democrats were to win the Senate, perhaps the chairman of the Budget Committee again, and then he would have all these staggering powers as the chairperson of the Budget Committee. Just a poor joke, folks. The Budget Committee could dictate which other committees must cut and how much. What a position. If an authorizing committee's package did not meet the Budget Committee's approval, it could rewrite the cuts in that committee's jurisdiction and move them directly to the Senate floor under rules making amendments extremely difficult. The generalist Budget Committee's attempts to legislate in other committees' jurisdiction would have a high risk of negative unintended consequences. Making the passage of a congressional budget resolution trigger this deeply problematic process would give members yet another reason not to pass such a resolution. As it's such a revolution, yeah, it would be a revolution too. As it stands, Congress rarely passes a budget resolution when the control of its two houses is divided, and often fails to do so even when the control is unified. And budget resolutions encourage thoughtful long term planning. We should be seeking ways to encourage Congress to undertake this process, not creating another set of unappealing political consequences for doing so. In the current environment, Republicans will uniformly oppose any tax increases, meaning that by reconciliation is likely to depend almost entirely on spending cuts. Great, that's exactly what we need, right? Spending cuts when we need to have the Green New Deal, spending cuts when we need to go to a Medicare for all plan, spending cuts when we need to improve our infrastructure and revolutionize our educational system, spending cuts when we have to forgive student loan debt, spending cuts when we have so much else to do in this country that I forget all the various things we have to do. This is totally ridiculous. Social Security is statutorily exempt from the reconciliation cuts, and the Pentagon is funded with annual appropriations and so does not receive the quote direct spending that reconciliation bills can cut. Great, so we can cut almost everything except for Social Security, okay, and except, of course, what happened here, and except, of course, for cuts in the military budget, which are the cuts we most badly need, right? Isn't that wonderful? What a wonderful bill this is. I think we need to recommend that Sheldon Whitehouse leave the Senate for a while so that he can see a very good psychiatrist. So I fear he has lost his senses. He has bitten the bitter pill of bipartisanship, and he thinks that it is sugar. Reaching a large deficit reduction target without substantial Medicare and Medicaid cuts will typically be implausible. Therefore, members wanting to protect those programs for potential auto reconciliation cuts may vote against any budget resolutions to avoid triggering that process. So from here on in, there's only going to be continuing resolutions. Everything's going to stay the same. We won't be able to move at all because they won't be able to pass a budget resolution. If Senators Enzi and Whitehouse are serious about restraining the deficit, they should go to the root of the problem, which is the use of fast track by reconciliation procedures to pass the budget busting type of legislation. Congress created reconciliation to reduce the deficit. It was only much later that enterprising members got the idea of turning it on its head to rush through members that increased the deficit. The 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts that replaced the late 1990s budget surplus with massive deficits both relied on reconciliation procedures to overcome their lack of broad support. So did the 2017 tax cuts, which are adding hundreds of millions of dollars to the deficit each year. I thought they were adding hundreds of billions of dollars to the deficit each year. I think that our author has made a mistake there. It's not an M, it's a B. Billions of dollars, okay, to the deficit each year. But let me call your attention, okay, to the fact that the whole assumption of this article is that it is meritorious to reduce the deficit. It is meritorious to aim for a balanced budget, okay, eventually. Okay, and it is meritorious to have procedures for doing reconciliation that result in cutting deficits and reducing deficits. So David Super is not against the idea of by reducing deficits. He's just against this particular way of actually reducing deficits. Over considerable resistance from the left wing of their caucus, but Democrats imposed strict pay-as-you-go rules last winter when they regained control of the House. These rules, however, can be changed by a future House majority and do not affect the Senate. Real budget process reform would reimpose the pay-as-you-go rules enacted in the Bipartisan Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. This would prevent budget busting in the first place. At a minimum, these rules should apply to fast-track reconciliation bills. S-2765 is at best just an awkward and dangerous attempt to chase down the horse after it has already escaped the barn. We can do much better. Yes, we can, but not through going back to the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. That's just going to cripple us in adapting to the climate emergency and to the need to pass much other legislation that, by the way, is part of the Bernie Sanders agenda and part of the progressive agenda. So this particular article is highly anti-progressive in, its orientation. It puts so-called fiscal sustainability, faux fiscal sustainability, above any other goal of the budgetary process. It assumes that there is a fiscal sustainability within the federal government, a government which is, by the way, a monetary sovereign, and which, according to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, has no limits on how much money it is able to create. Now, there may be practical limits, but in law, there is no limit. So, this article is saying, let us tie our shoelaces all up again in these pay-go rules, for which there is no rhyme or reason except the unfounded assumption that it is better to have lower deficits and that it is better to get to a balanced budget than it is to pass full employment budgets and have full employment budgets every year. Of course, I strongly disagree with that. And now I want to shift over to a blog post of mine from some time ago. It asks the question of whether overt congressional financing is in conflict with the current PAYGO system of fiscal legislation in the House. Actually, the PAYGO system had weakened by that time, but when Nancy Pelosi got back in as the Speaker of the House, the first thing she did was to reinstate it in the House. Anyway, this particular blog post followed on to other blog posts. The first was on what overt congressional financing is, and the second is about whether overt congressional financing is inflationary or not. And if you happen to click on the link sending you to my website, then you can read those. They both are very short. They're mercifully short. This one is mercifully short too, but it focuses on the question of whether overt congressional financing, which just has the Federal Reserve creating the reserves in the Treasury spending account that are necessary to spend to allow the Treasury to make the mandated spending in appropriation bills. And also, it's also about actually providing the reserves that are necessary to repay all federal debts and interest falling due uh, within the period of a budget appropriation. So, the way I answer the question, I'll put this on clearly so you can see it. My answer to this question is very simple. It says, yes, it is. However, the PAYGO system is one that a progressive House of Representatives will have to get rid of. The reasons for this are: one, the system is biased towards deficit neutrality projected over a time period, okay, of a decade, even though savings and import the desires of people may require continuous deficit spending to maintain true full employment. So, two, quote, PAYGO, unquote, leads to a stagnating economy and increasing inequality with the passage of time. Three, the budget process generally doesn't work to produce appropriations bills, so that continuing resolutions, CR bills, are needed to avoid government shutdowns. And finally, four, the Congressional Budget Office is technically incapable of accurately projecting deficit neutrality over a 10-year period or even much shorter time frames than that, so that a necessary condition for, quote, PAYGO, unquote, to be successful, even on its own terms, isn't realized in Congress. Studies done of the projection accuracy of the CBO, and I link here to a link that I've given you in the description. Okay. It's a video of Justin Santopietro's presentation to the annual MMT conference. Actually, this was done, if I recall correctly, at the first MMT conference about 3 years ago at the UMKC. But Justin is a former staffer in Congress, also a student, okay, of MMT, and most recently in 2018 was a primary candidate for Congress, if I recall correctly, in the Virginia, I think it was in the Virginia 9th, okay, that he was the candidate. It's in the CD that contains, I believe, okay, it's VPI, and it's around the Blacksburg area, very much of which is actually depressed. Justin was a very progressive candidate. He was beaten by a more orthodox progressive in the primary, and then that candidate in turn was defeated by the Republican in the area because he wasn't offering anything particularly exciting in his platform. Anyway, be that as it may, I strongly recommend that you watch this video of Justin's. His presentation, is excellent and very entertaining as well. It's 22 minutes, very well spent. As I was saying, the projections require revisions within a single fiscal year. In certain years, there have been errors of trillions of dollars in CBO projections. So relying on CBO projections in policymaking is nonsensical. But nevertheless, its projections have had considerable impact on policymaking and have consistently created an austerity bias in the budget process. Since when? Since 1974, when the CBO was first established. And when the first director of the CBO, Alice Rivlin, was appointed to head it up. Ever since then, the CBO has had an austerity bias in its projections. Going on, the PAYGO budgeting system must be replaced by a spend tax system targeting a budget supporting full employment, price stability, and other aspects of public purpose. CBO's role in such a system should be limited to evaluations of past policies and programs to provide guidance about policy impact so that Congress can abandon what is not working and reinforce what is working. In other words, CBO's role should be limited to evaluations alone and not to projections that it cannot make. CBO will have a difficult enough time actually estimating policy impacts after they have happened. They often don't know how to measure those. That's going to be sufficiently difficult for them. That's the kind of guidance Congress needs, to decide on what's not working and to decide on what has been working and what we need to have even more of. Now that's practical. That's real world based. But this dream system of trying to project what's going to happen over 10 years when you can't even do so over 6 months. How do I know they can't do so over 6 months? Because each year when they set out, to make a projection for the fiscal year begins in October, on October 1st. CBO puts out the first projections for the fiscal year, usually in January. But by May or by June, it needs a second round of CBO projections for the rest of the fiscal year, which ends at the end of September. So it can't even get it right between January and June with a 3-month head start. 3 months of the fiscal year has already happened. And it's still, the January projections are not accurate when we're getting into June, and it needs new projections. And these people are living in a fantasy world when they decide to play the game of budgeting based on what the CBO is going to project out 10 years. The CBO has no capability to project out 10 years. What this is about is institutionalizing a permanent austerity system before the American public. And of course, I am entirely against it. I'm one of the guys who will tell you that if we look at what a full employment budget really requires at this time, we're probably we'd probably be estimating something like 10 to 12% of GDP in deficits each year. 10% is $2.1 trillion in deficit. 12% is more like $2.4 to $2.5 trillion worth of deficits that we need if we want a full employment economy, if that is our goal. We're not using this policy space. Trump wasn't even using this amount of policy space to try to give money to the class that he most favored, the top tenth of 1%, certainly the top 1%. Even then, he wasn't using all the policy space. Anyway, the first thing I want to do is to declare my unreserved opposition to this bill in the form it's been stated by Enzi and by White House. It absolutely undermines progressive politics. Every progressive has to be unreservedly against it and has to make their full-throated opposition to it known to their senators. That is number one. Number two, I am getting sick and tired. Sick and tired of these utterly ignorant senators and congresspeople doing these very dangerous things on the pretense that they know what they're doing, that they're still looking at the federal budget as a household budget. They're still looking at the idea of fiscal sustainability as some problem which the United States has. The only fiscal sustainability problem we have is one that the Congress itself creates. That fiscal sustainability problem is the debt limit. It's the debt ceiling. That's the fiscal sustainability problem. Because when the Treasury comes close to the debt ceiling, the spending mandated by Congress is then hindered. Because the Treasury can no longer sell Treasury securities, cannot increase the debt, quote, unquote. Okay. There are a few good ways to remove the barriers to rational spending by the federal government. Spending for a Green New Deal that would provide a full employment budget. Spending for Medicare for all. Spending for infrastructure. Spending for free college. Spending for eliminating student debt. Spending for expanding Social Security. And all the other spending we need. And that remedy is to remove artificial barriers to spending and accept that the relevant barriers to spending exist in the area of the likely impact of the spending. Spending by the federal government that is going to deliver injustices to people is bad spending. It doesn't matter how much deficit is involved. or how much surplus is involved. If it's unjust, it's bad spending. If it creates inflation, it's bad spending. If it creates a greater amount of inequality in our society, it's bad spending. If it has negative impacts on the climate, it's bad spending. There are dozens of things that mark a particular budget item as bad spending. But not one of those things relates to the size of the national debt, to the debt to GDP ratio, or to the size of the deficit itself, unless its size goes over the amount that would create a full employment economy, because then that's likely to cause inflation. So, we need our Congress people to know that we know that the United States is a monetary sovereign, and that they need to know what that means. We can't continue to ignore the MMT, monetary sovereignty issue. We have to surface that issue. We have to educate people about that. Why is Sheldon Whitehouse able to join Mike Enzi in a bipartisan bill coming out of the Senate attempting to shackle the Congress in this way and make people hate Congress even more and hate the federal government even more and create more Donald Trumps in the future? Why is that even a possibility? Because Sheldon Whitehouse evidently doesn't understand that the federal government is not a household, and the federal budget is not like a household budget. It doesn't have to be balanced, because Article 1, Section 8 allows the federal government to pay any bills that it incurs, no matter the size of those bills. So let us get this basic level of education into our congresspeople, into our senators. We've needed this now for years. I've been talking about this myself now for going on 10 years. It'll be 10 years in December. It'll be 10 years next month. I've written countless blogs on it. I've written 7 ebooks about it, okay, in various ways. I wrote 2 ebooks that were devoted to the issue of fiscal responsibility, and specifically unmasking the network in Washington, D.C. surrounding the Peterson Foundation, all the think tanks, all the interests that was circulating around that. And what do I see in this bipartisan bill? What do I see? What I see is a bill emerging that looks like it was a bill in response to pressure from the Peterson network of forces themselves. Perhaps a bill that would lead to a compromise on bringing pay-go back in both houses of Congress. Exactly what the Peterson network wants us to see. This is just absolutely incredible to me that this would happen. Why hasn't this shifted? I have no idea. Why see why? Okay. I have no idea how long this screen is going to refresh, how long it's going to be until it refreshes. I will. I must have shifted this over to my other screen 4 or 5 minutes ago, and I'm still seeing it. Anyway, so we really need to have that education campaign accelerated. If a senator as prominent as Sheldon Whitehouse and as ostensibly progressive as Sheldon Whitehouse is, thinks it's okay to author a bill of this kind at this late stage of the game, then this means that we have to fight much harder than we've been fighting to educate people in the House and the Senate about the issues in driving towards a balanced budget, especially at this juncture of the needs that we have in the federal government. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get this to shift again because it should not be showing my screen this way, and it apparently is. I'm going to refresh my screen here and see if that makes a difference. If you will indulge me for one moment. I'm sorry, I'm just trying. Okay, thanks. Now to take a look at your comments at this point. Where is everyone here tonight? Well, Mark Collins has joined. Hi, Mark. And Bonnie's joined. Hey, Bonnie. And Russell says, this neoliberal nonsense makes me batshit crazy. Me too, Russell. Is this bill you are talking about already law? No, it's something that's been written by the Budget Committee in the Senate. It's just been introduced. Isn't law. Mark says this is not about anything other than complying with the private lending industry's wishes. Chronic recession until the banking investors can buy up all the nation's assets for 2 cents on the dollar. Every other industry will lose in some way at some time, even if they're able to make some gains in the immediate quarter. Yeah, that is probably true, Mark. That's an astute comment. Susan Eldridge has joined. My daughter Devorah has joined. Hi, Devorah. Hi, Susan. Lana said, that was a wonderful presentation. I was in the room when he was speaking. Oh, you mean when Justin was speaking? Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation, wasn't it? Yeah, Justin did great. And Jim Rushford has joined, and Russell says, permanent austerity system. That's enough to really frost the gonads. It's enough to start a revolution. I mean, they're just asking for bringing Trump back, even if Trump is defeated in 2020. They're just asking to bring him back in 2024, or bring back somebody even worse than Trump. Maybe somebody smarter like Ted Cruz. Steve says, hi, Dr. Joe. Hi, Steve. Thank you for sharing so actively during my last live stream. That was very much appreciated. And Dolores has joined. Hi, Dolores. Susan said, phone bank for Bernie tonight. Voter told me he's not voting for Bernie because he doesn't want his taxes to go up, and he likes that Trump gave him a tax cut. Well, you'll always hit some voters who are going to say that because he did give a few voters a tax cut after all. But it's just really, really incredible. Okay. If there are no other comments, I'm going to go on to my third article for tonight, which is a very significant article. It's the article about the end of the middle class. And it was written by Marshall Auerbach. And Marshall is one of the MMTers, a fairly early MMTer. I don't know exactly when he became an MMTer, but by the time of the MMT Fiscal Sustainability Conference in 2010 that I helped to organize, and that was my idea, one of the panelists was Marshall Auerbach, and he was right there with Bill Mitchell, Warren Mosler, Stephanie Kelton, and Randy Ray, and Pavlina Chernyeva. They were all there, and Marshall gave the presentation on inflation. And it was an excellent one. And he also did an excellent job as a discussant all through the day. If you ever get to see the videos on that, I think they still are online. And those videos are really terrific, not least because they incorporated the comments from the audience. There was extensive interaction with the attendees at the conference. So Marshall, who's also worked for INET and who's been very active, in MMT circles, and a blogger for a while, at UMKC. He's really a terrific economist, and I think he wrote a very, very good article here, which I'll proceed to present to you now. So Marshall wrote this for the Independent Media Institute, and there are a lot of people publishing through there now, including R.J. Eskow and Tom Hartman. So Marshall is in good company there, and there are also a number of others who were very good. But the title of this article is, quote, "Free Markets Will Be the End of the Middle Class." And this is about national industrial policy. And Marshall correctly indicates that it was once something you might read about in today's equivalent of a friend's Facebook post, as hard as that might sound to believe. It was in newspapers. It was on the radios. Taxi drivers had opinions about it. That all changed in the last 35 years when everybody became ignorant, right? When the rise and fall of the stock market and the shallow conversation about unemployment rates took over, industrial policy became an inside baseball conversation, and to the extent that it was discussed, it was through the prism of whether it imperiled the golden gospel and great economic distraction of our time, quote, the free market, unquote. The decades of free market propaganda we've been exposed to are basically an exercise in distracting the public from the meaningful choices that are now made behind closed doors. The two big political parties that outwardly represent symbolic issues like gun rights and school prayer spend the bulk of their time and political energy on complex industrial and the regulatory questions. But much like Nero fiddling while Rome burned, they better start considering the question of a national industrial policy before there's no industry left to manage. Manufacturing is now its smallest share of the U.S. economy in 72 years, reports Bloomberg. Multinational supply chains undermine the negotiating power of workers, thereby exacerbating inequality. Marshall, if I'm not mistaken, also writes for Bloomberg these days as well. Anyway, uh, are there ways to bring back manufacturing? Or should we just capitulate to a mindset that argues that these jobs are gone for good, that software retention is good enough, even as we shift what's left of our manufacturing center overseas to sweatshop economies? Marshall says that seems short sighted. After all, it's pretty easy to steal intellectual property, IP, that is. It's not so easy to steal an auto manufacturing facility. The real question is, in the absence of some sort of national industrial strategy, how do Western societies retain a viable middle class? Decades of middle class exposure to favor China and other Asian countries' industrial capacity have foisted it right back from elite circles into our politics in the ballot box in spectacular fashion through the unlikely Donald Trump, who, in his typically blunderbuss fashion, has called attention to some serious deficiencies in our current globalized system and the competitive threat posed by China, to which we have remained oblivious for all too long. Not that Trump's 19th century protectionism actually represents the right policy response, but his concerns about Beijing make sense when you compare how much China invests in its own industrial base compared to the U.S. Robert D. Atkinson and Caleb Foote of the Information Technology Innovation Foundation write that a recent Harvard Business School, quote, study estimated the Chinese government's national, provincial, and local paid for a whopping 22.2% of business R&D in 2015, with 95% of Chinese firms in six industries receiving government cash: petrochemicals, electronics, also metals and materials, and machinery and equipment, pharmaceuticals, and biotechnology and information technology. In addition to direct government grants on R&D, Atkinson and Foote estimate that, quote, the Chinese R&D tax credit is between 3 and 4.6 times more generous than the U.S. tax credit. To match China's R&D tax credit generosity, the U.S. rate for the alternative simplified credit would have to be increased from 14% to between 35 and 40%, unquote. Atkinson and Foote also note that quite, quote, 97% of American federal government funding went to just three sectors: transportation equipment, which includes such as fighter jets and missiles and the like, 14 billion, also professional, scientific, and technical services, 5 billion, and computer and electronic products, 4 billion. That's all. Jeez. Taken in aggregate, Atkinson and Foote calculate that, quote, nearly 25% of all R&D expenditures in China come in the form of government subsidies to firms, unquote. That's the sort of thing that must enter the calculations of antitrust advocates when they call for breaking up big tech without considering the ramifications to research and development, especially relative to their Chinese counterparts. Statistically, as Anne Mary Knott and Carl Vieregger find in a 2016 paper, quote, reconciling the firm size can innovation puzzle, unquote. There are ample studies illustrating that R&D spending and R&D productivity increase with scale. Why does this matter? Robert Kuttner, writing at the Huffington Post, at the inception of the Obama presidency, made a compelling argument that many of America's great industrial enterprises did not simply spring up spontaneously via the magic of the quote free market unquote. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Quote, the commercial leadership of America in aerospace is no naturally occurring phenomenon. It reflects trillions of dollars of subsidy from the Pentagon and from NASA. Likewise, U.S. dominance in pharmaceuticals is the result of government subsidy of basic research, favorable patent treatment, and the fact that the American consumer of prescription drugs is made to overpay, giving the industry exorbitant profits to plow back into research. Throwing $700 billion in America's wounded banks is also an industrial policy. Quote, so if we can have implicit industrial policies for these industries, why not explicit policies to rebuild our auto industry, our steel industry, our machine tool industry, and the industries of the next century, such as green energy and high-speed rail? Question mark. And why not devise some clean standards for which industries deserve help, some clear standards for which industries deserve help, and why, and what they owe America in return, unquote. Like maybe staying here in turn, right? In fact, Kuttner describes a problem that well preceded Barack Obama. Our belief in national industrial planning has been undermined to the extent that the U.S. began to adhere to a doctrine of shareholder capitalism in the 1980s and beyond, a philosophy that minimized the role of the state and gave primacy to short-term profitability as well as production growth but through efficiency, i.e. downsizing and mergers, corporate prioritization of maximizing shareholders' value, and the ways American corporations have minimized long-term R&D expenditures and capital investment, all of which have resulted in the, quote, unproductive disgorging of corporate cash profits through extremely massive dividend payouts and unprecedented spending on stock repurchases, overproductive investment in innovation, right? But, right, but, right, but, 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 in innovation, right, by Servas, Storm, and CWM Nastapad. Although European companies have not gone quite as far down that route, their stakeholder capitalism culture has been somewhat subverted to the same short-term goals as their American counterparts, as evidenced via Volkswagen's emission scandal and the erosion of workers' rights via the Hartz labor reforms, which actually undermined the union's stakeholder status in the companies, thereby freeing up the the management to adopt many of the less attractive American shareholder capitalism practices. The EU, too, is now belatedly recognizing the competitive threat posed by China. There's no doubt that the European the classes, the political classes, are also becoming mindful that there are votes to be won here as well, as Trump correctly calculated in 2016. In the U.S., industrial policy is increasingly finding advocates on both the left, okay, Elizabeth Warren's policy director, Ganesh Sitar, Sitaraman, and the right, actually Michael Lind, via the convenient marriage of national security considerations and with international investment in trade. If trade policy is ultimately subordinated to national security concerns, it is conceivable that industrial policy could be bipartisanized, thereby giving primacy to homegrown strategic industries necessary to sustain viable national defense and security. but this approach is not without its risks. It is unclear whether the national securitification of the industrial policy renaissance will actually enhance or hinder creativity and risk taking, or merely cause these firms to decline altogether as viable civilian competitors vis-a-vis Beijing. The current travails of Boeing actually provide a salutary illustration of the risks of going too far down the Pentagon rat hole. And there are a number of recent studies illustrating that the case for dual use, i.e., civilian, and the uh, uh, civilian and military manufacturing, does not substantially enhance civilian industrialization and indeed may retard overall economic growth. On the other hand, as the venture capitalist William Janeway highlights in his seminal work, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, there are advantages at times to being, quote, decoupled from any direct concern with economic return. It allowed the Defense Department to fund numerous alternative research agendas, underwriting the wasteful, quote unquote, search for solutions that inevitably accompanies any effort to push back the frontiers of knowledge, unquote. So there's a balance to be struck here. But just as Janeway notes, quote, the strategic state interventions that have shaped the market economy over generations have depended on grander themes: national development, national security, social justice, about liberation from disease, that transcended the calculus of welfare economics and the logic of market failure, unquote. Furthermore, to the extent that national security considerations retard offshoring and global labor arbitrage, it can enhance the prospects for a viable form of, quote, national developmentalism, unquote, given that both mean tighter labor markets and higher wages, which in turn will likely push firms to upgrading R&D spending in order to upgrade on the high end of the technology curve, as Seymour Melman argued years ago, as well as enhancing productivity gains. As author Ted Furtick has observed, higher productivity makes possible more generous welfare states and helps national industries compete to supply the world with high-tech products. If technological leadership and a prosperous patriotic citizenry are the surest guarantees of military preponderance, such an economic policy is actually the best strategy for the military in an era of great power competition. Both the left and right are beginning to recognize that it makes no sense to make war on wage earners while claiming to protect the same wage earners from Chinese competition. The governments need to do more than act as a neutral empire whose role never extends beyond by fixing market failures. As Janeway has illustrated, governments have historically promoted the basic research that fueled innovation and nurtured the talent and skills that, quote, became the foundation of the innovation economy, unquote. Quote, the central research laboratories of the great corporations were first supplemented and then supplanted by direct state funding of research, unquote. But in spite of providing the foundational research for a number of leading commercial products, e.g., Apple's iPhone, the government has proved reticent in considering alternative forms of ownership structure, e.g., perhaps a, quote, government golden share, which gives veto rights on key strategic issues such as relocation, offshoring, special voting rights for unions, perhaps, or retaining intellectual property rights and corresponding royalty streams to reflect the magnitude of their own R&D efforts, as Professor Mariana Mazzucato has proposed in the past. She's also someone who's very closely associated with MMT economics. At the very least, We need to consider these alternative ownership structures that focus on entrepreneurial development, on value creation, as opposed to capitulating to the depredations of rentier capitalism on the spurious grounds that this is a neutral byproduct of the market's efficient allocation of resources. But within the U.S., national industrial policy also suits green advocates such as Senator Bernie Sanders, whose Green New Deal plan, while failing to address domestic slash local content or manufacturing in the broadest possible sense, at least begins to move the needle with regard to the federal government building and owning a national renewable grid. Likewise, in Europe, he's talking about the power grid here. Likewise, in Europe, German economy minister Peter Altmaier recently published a quote National Industrial Strategy 2030 unquote, which according to Dalia Marin, K. Bruegel think tank in Brussels, the yes, I guess it's the Bruegel think tank in Brussels, aims to protect German firms against state subsidized Chinese competitors. Strategy identifies key industrial sectors that will receive special government support, calls for establishing the production of electric car batteries in Europe, and advocates for mergers to achieve economies of scale. Unquote. It is striking that EU policymakers such as Lars Feld of the German Council of Economic Experts still apparently thinks it is a protectionist step too far to consider coordinating with the car companies, where there is already a high degree of trans-European policy coordination and international consolidation, and other sectors to help them all at the same time as Beijing is now doing. Of course, it would help to embed this in a manufacturing based Green New Deal, but it represents a healthy corrective to offshoring advocates who continue to advocate that their car industry should migrate to China on the short term grounds of cost consideration alone. Essentially, the goal should be to protect the industries, that policymakers think will be strategically important from outsiders, and to further integrate with allies and partners to achieve efficiencies and also production scale. Parenthetically, it seems particularly perverse right at this juncture for the UK to break away from all this continental European integration and try to go it alone via Brexit. The aim should not be to protect private rent seeking and increasing private uh, monopolization under the guise of industrial policy, which, as Dalia Marin notes, is why EU Competition Commissioner, um, I guess, okay, it's Margrethe Vestager, blocked the proposed merger between France's Alstom and Germany's Siemens. The two companies, quote, rarely compete with CRRC in third countries because the Chinese company mainly focuses on its home market. Hence, the grounds for creating, quote, heavyweight champions was really a cover for developing an oligopoly instead. Much of the focus of uh, um, uh, much of the focus of the negotiations and the seemingly endless trade negotiations between the U.S. and China has been on American efforts to dismantle the wave of subsidies and industrial support that Beijing furnishes to its domestic industries. This seems both unrealistic as well as being the exact opposite of what the U.S. should be doing if it hopes to level or at least carve up the playing field. Likewise, the problem in the EU and the US is not the size of these companies generated generated by national developmentalism, but a size neutral form of national regulation that precludes these companies from stifling the competition. That would have to be a very effective form, okay, of regulation if it's to succeed against the really large companies. The goal of a truly successful and workable industrial policy, says Marshall, should be to create an environment that supports and sustains value creation and that socializes the benefits of the R&D for society as a whole rather than simply licensing it or selling it on to private companies so that it just becomes a vehicle that sustains rent extraction for private profits alone. We are slowly but surely starting to move away from market fundamentalism, but we still have yet to make the full conceptual leap towards a sustainable industrial policy that creates an economy for all. At least this is now becoming a fit discussion as far as policy making goes, as many of the neoliberal shibboleths of the past 40 years are gradually being reconsidered, okay, and abandoned. That is a start. But we do have to note, of course, to append a comment, okay, to Marshall's article, that even as many are abandoning the neoliberal shibboleths of the past, the Senate Budget Committee is not abandoning the shibboleths, since its chairperson and its ranking member have now collaborated on a bipartisan neoliberal shibboleth bill. It's a bill completely consistent with the neoliberal shibboleths of the past 40 years. So maybe in general we have a start, but specifically in the U.S. Senate, it's still lagging behind by about 40 years. Anyway, this article was produced by Economy for All, a project of the Independent Media Institute. So, that is that particular article. I would like to now consider your comments. And once again, so Susan had to log off. An early day tomorrow. Matt Waldy joined. I don't know how long ago. Lana says she hasn't seen Marshall Auerbach recently. No. Looks like he may have been over in Europe for a while. He might have been doing a bunch of very interesting things. He might even have been over in China for a while. And Elizabeth but Netherland is here. Liz. And Russ says, got to call it a night. See you again soon. Yes, Russ, see you again soon. Any other comments or questions before I sign off for tonight? Please remember my central message on this, which was we've got to blast this bipartisan Senate Budget Committee bill out of the water. And by the way, I'm sure Bernie Sanders is still a member of the Budget Committee. So how did he vote when it came to this bill? Or perhaps there haven't been any votes. But why hasn't he made his presence felt with respect to this bill? This bill is clearly out of bounds. It is just out of bounds. It is totally ridiculous. Any pay-go bill in the Senate would be totally ridiculous. Anyway, please share, like, and subscribe, and please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And let me see whether you've made any comments. Dolores says, thank you and good night. Thank you for coming, Dolores. Are there any other comments or questions? Lana asks, does Stephanie know about this? I'm sure she knows about it by now. There are probably 150 people who have told her. I'm sure she knows about it. If not, we can certainly tweet her tonight. As soon as we post this onto YouTube, we'll tweet her. How about that, Lana? Any other questions or comments? If not, I'm going to sign off. I've had a long day today. Thank you for coming, and thank you for sticking around for the full period of time. I certainly appreciate that. Please share this. I think it was an important video because the new Senate budget bill is a disaster from our point of view. And by the way, almost every time you see a bipartisan bill, it is always a disaster. They're always picking our pockets. When they get to agree on something, it's almost invariably about faux fiscal responsibility and cutting necessary spending for the have nots, or doing tax cuts for people who don't need to have the tax cuts. So, when they're doing a bipartisan bill, they're getting ready to pick your pocket. Make sure that they know, that you know, that they're getting ready to pick your pocket. It's real important. I'm really pissed about this, and you should be too. This type of bill is something that should be off limits in the future. There needs to be a great outcry over this. And on that note, I will say good night. I'll see you again on Saturday at roughly 9 o'clock. I will be off tomorrow, however. And so, good night. Good night.